My name's George Smerin, and I'm a musician and web developer, well, mostly a front-end web developer. Over the past few years, I've been working in product teams building web applications in React. I've really loved adapting my workflow to using components and JSX and getting fully immersed in the React ecosystem with all the tools and plugins and frameworks that surround it. So since I've started working with React, I've wanted to transform my stagnant old personal website into something that better reflects the work I'm doing today, and also something that inspires me to want to write more content about the things I'm learning in both music and technology, actually. So so I've tried a few different ways of doing that with Create React App and Next.js framework, and got it looking quite nice, but always fell down when it came to bringing in data, because obviously I've got a day job and I'm trying to do it in evenings and the weekends, and everything I tried just seemed like overkill, to be honest. I'd do it for a few evenings and then I'd just get a bit bored, I guess, or life would take over. So I'd forget about it until I'd pick it up again when I had a new approach to try out. So needless to say, it took a while and there was no site being launched. Anyway, that will change when I heard about Gatsby. It was last summer they introduced version 2, and almost straight away, lots of people seem to be writing about it online and talking about it. So some notable developers like Dan Abramov, Wes Boss, Joel Hooks, Kent C. Dodds, they were all talking about rebuilding their sites in Gatsby. So I obviously took note of that and gave it a go, and needless to say, obviously quite liked it, otherwise that's why I'm standing here today. I was really amazed by how quick it was to get up and running and build out the site. But mostly the things I've been struggling with my other approaches was bringing in the data and where to host the content. They were just made so simple by Gatsby. And also to really finish off the site and give it sort of the level of finesse that I really wanted to be very proud of it, that was also made really easy. Okay, so thank you, Gatsby. I'm going to give tonight a sort of a fairly short introduction into what Gatsby is, why you might want to use it, and how you'd use it, and then we'll look in a little bit of depth at some of the best features I think it has to offer. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along, but at the end we'll have a Q&A session. Okay, so what is Gatsby? Just out of interest, how many people here have actually used Gatsby before? Okay, not too many, that's good. So this is just an introductory talk, so I hope it's of value to you guys who have used it, and girls. But yeah, for the rest of you, it is just an introduction. So what is Gatsby? Gatsby is a framework for React, and it's powered by GraphQL. Now, if you're not exactly sure what GraphQL is, we're going to look at that a bit closer very soon. Gatsby is used to build static progressive web apps. Now, what does that mean? Well, static because Gatsby generates static HTML files from your source code. It's great for building websites that don't rely on a lot of dynamic content. So you're not going to want to use it to build the next Facebook or Twitter, but it is great for a personal blog or a brochure-style website. Now, static site generators are nothing new. But with Gatsby, one thing it's really important to realize is that while it does generate static HTML files for the pages of our site, these pages are still made up of React components. So we aren't limited to only building static sites. You can still go off and fetch data on page load and use it within your React app as you'd expect. Now, to differentiate themselves from other static generators, site generators, that's why I guess they've gone with static progressive web apps. Now, as I'm sure quite a few of you know, a progressive web app is a website that, a very brief description, is a website that uses some modern browser features. So for example, it works offline in some situations, and it's also installable to your phone, similar to a native app would be. There's a few other things. It's actually just a checklist of best practices, but Gatsby makes it very easy to fulfill those criteria and make your website a progressive web app. Okay, yeah, so doesn't make it a progressive web app out of the box. There is a little bit of configuration, but it probably took me half an hour to tick all the criteria that made it a progressive web app, so I was very happy with that. Okay, so we talked about what Gatsby is. Now, why would you want to use it? Now, if you've done any reading on Gatsby at all, you've probably noticed this little phrase they've got, it is blazing fast. And it is true. Performance is really at the heart of what the Gatsby team is trying to achieve. I mean, as with any static site generator, Gatsby generates HTML files at build time. So these are then ready to be sent straight to the browser when a user requests them. This differs to server-side rendering, for example, which is when the HTML is created by the server at the time of request, and only when it's ready will it be sent to the browser. So that's always going to be a little bit slower than using static HTML files. So Gatsby also gives you code and data splitting by default. That means that only the critical CSS, JavaScript, and data are sent to the browser. Other resources can then be prefetched after page load, meaning that further pages loads are even faster. Another major benefit is that it's very cheap and easy to host. You can simply upload the build folder to any old shared hosting provider, and it will work with no extra configuration. Again, these are just HTML files we're dealing with. There are some much better hosting options available. These can handle your build process and deployment automatically, but we're going to look at those a bit more towards the end. The other key benefit for me is it's got great developer experience. It's so quick to get up and running, and there's a vast array of Gatsby plugins which will make adding certain functionality a breeze. In particular, the plugins that deal with pulling in data are going to save you a lot of time. And also the plugins that deal with images are just fantastic. So we will look at that in a minute. Right. How does Gatsby work? Well, at its very simplest, you add a component for each page of your website into a folder named Pages. Gatsby will then convert every component in the Pages directory into an HTML file with the URL the same as the component name. Now, if you're then just about to deploy the site, you just upload that build folder. But also during development, it does set up a server, so you can see your changes in real time with hot reloading, because no one wants to be refreshing the page anymore, do they? To see your changes. Okay, so Gatsby gets much more interesting when you start to pull in data from other sources. Those sources could be an existing CMS, which you just want to build a new front end for. So that could be WordPress, Drupal, or others, because they expose a REST API, and you can hook into that, or Gatsby can. They could be one of the new breed of headless CMSs, such as Contentful, Firebase, GraphCMS, or Sanity. They could be just about any other API. They could also be local files from within your project source code, such as Markdown, JSON, or a CSV. Now, Gatsby say themselves that they can pull data from anywhere. I'm not going to go and make that claim. That's up to them to say. But those are the ones that I've looked into, and they definitely work. And there's a nice plugin to help make it easy for you to do that, to configure it. Now, I'd say one of the reasons it's become very popular in the developer community is that it's the simplest way of getting it up and running with a blog, for example, is to use Markdown files for the blog posts. Now, it might not seem quite as nice as using a CMS, but I'm sure no one here is afraid to edit a Markdown file. And the best thing about that is that those are just stored in a directory within your project source. So you don't have to have another server or another application, no more hosting. So they're all stored within the same project as the rest of your Gatsby code. At the start of the Markdown file, we've got the front matter section, which is where you can put some important information. The only one that's really necessary is the path, because when you're consuming these the posts, you obviously you've got to create the page, so it needs to know what path to use. Other things such as date and title are pretty obvious, and you can have whatever you want, tags, categories, an excerpt, because later on you're going to be able to query for this data and use it however you want with JavaScript. So this is just a very simple example, and the rest of the Markdown file is just as you'd expect. That's the content of your post. So using Markdown is obviously going to be much better suited to developers such as ourselves for a personal blog. It's not going to be quite as useful if you've got a client who's going to be updating their own content. So in that situation, you're going to want to use one of the options from the previous list, such as WordPress or Drupal, or a headless CMS is probably the best option if you're starting afresh. Okay, so Gatsby is pulling in data from a variety of sources. You configure it to do that, and you've got some plugins that make it pretty straightforward. Now, you need to access that data, and that's where GraphQL comes in. GraphQL is a querying language developed by Facebook a few years ago. It's gaining in popularity, and Gatsby is a great place to start using it, because you don't actually have to set up the server yourself. You can just use the querying language. We're going to look at exactly how a GraphQL query looks now. So this is a bit of a contrived example, but this would be what you would see in your React component. So generally at the page level, but you can also do it in some situations from any component. So this is a GraphQL query. It does look like JavaScript. It's probably intended to look fairly similar, but it's not. Sorry, JavaScript object. Okay, so here we're querying for a post with the ID of 123. Now, with a typical REST API, you might hit an endpoint for a post and pass it that ID of 123, but you don't really have too much control over what gets returned. So you typically get the title, the date, you might get an excerpt, you might get all of the content for that post, tags, categories, which is great in a lot of situations, but if, for example, you just want to get the title, then you would use a query like this, and what will be returned looks very similar. This is a JavaScript object, gets returned, and then Gatsby makes that data immediately available within your React component via props. If you want to add the path to the query, it's just literally this simple, and the data that returns will show the path as well. So their tagline, ask for what you need, get exactly that, is pretty accurate. If we want multiple posts, then an array will be returned. So you can see down here we've got an array of posts. Gatsby also really elegantly handles sorting and filtering and limiting the data that's returned. As you can see in the top, we've got posts, order by, created at. Now, that's more of a Gatsby terminology up there, but I think all GraphQL works in a similar way. And you've got a variety of options depending on where you're using it. Okay, so as I said, these GraphQL queries are run from directly from within the React component that's going to consume the data, and Gatsby makes it available via props. So it's really easy, and it's all in one place, and it's all done for you. And so Gatsby is a great place to learn to get familiar with GraphQL, because I think GraphQL is going to get more popular in the future, and it's a good time to be learning it. Okay, so now we're going to have a bit of an example of just how fast Gatsby is. I said to you at the start that I've been rebuilding my site. It took me a while, but I eventually did launch it 2 weeks ago. It is quite simple, and it's actually focused on some music stuff I did last year, but in the future I'm probably going to add in some more technology stuff. So here it is. So I've got a nice big banner and 3 images and some content. So this is the home page, and this is what I've been testing for performance. I used the Lighthouse audit tool, which is available in Chrome DevTools. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. And that gives you scores for performance, SEO, accessibility, best practices, and progressive web app functionality. I'm pleased to say that this homepage at least ranks 100% in all of those categories, and Gatsby really did make that pretty easy. So here are some of the figures. You probably can't see that, some of the figures at the back, so I've made it a little bit bigger. Okay, so this is the values when Lighthouse, by its default setting, is to simulate a fast 3G network with a slower CPU, 4 times slower. Okay, so these aren't the real figures if you were looking at it on a laptop. Now, to get a 100% score, the first meaningful paint, Lighthouse thinks that should be 1.6 seconds. Gatsby's done it in 0.9, so that's just over half. Perceptual speed index is a little bit quicker at 1 second. And the time to interactive is a lot faster. So the target is 5 seconds, which does seem quite slow. But remember, this is a throttled network. And Gatsby's done it in 2 seconds. So that's a really big saving there. And bear in mind, that is the targets to get an 100% score. So read into that what you will. It's obviously not the be-all and end-all, but it's a good gauge, I think. So if you want to see what the performance is like on a normal Wi-Fi network, so just my one at home, it does vary a little bit when you refresh it. So I haven't done it loads of times to get the fastest, but typically these are the scores. 0.1 seconds for the first meaningful paint, 0.5 seconds perceptual speed index. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I think that is just a general guide. Perhaps someone can tell me later. But the one I think is really important is time to interactive. So that's gone from 5 seconds, which was their target, to 0.2 seconds to be interactive. I did look at some of my old, and I don't want to diss WordPress because I think it's still fantastic, and I certainly built my career on it. But I looked back at some of the sites I did quite a few years ago that haven't changed, and some of them were quite a lot closer to 10 seconds. So I'm pretty happy with 0.2 seconds there. Okay, so we looked at performance, and hopefully you'll agree it is pretty fast. And I know that my site wasn't particularly large, but one thing it did have was a big banner image and 3 images, and they do come out good quality. So that's a good time to talk about Gatsby plugins. My favorite one by far, and the one that really made me think that it was worth pursuing Gatsby, is the Gatsby Image plugin and how it handles images. Okay, so what's Gatsby Image? It gives you a component to use within your React files that is fairly similar in syntax to using just a normal image tag in HTML. But what you do need to do, which is a bit of extra work, you do need to query for your images via GraphQL. So you typically have your images stored in a folder anywhere within your project. You can configure Gatsby to look inside that folder, and then it'll put these images into the GraphQL server. So within your component, you can query for that image that you want with the file name, and it will return an object with a load of data about that actual image. And what Gatsby also does, using image sharp, is it processes it into a variety of different sizes as it sees appropriate. When you pass that data object into the Gatsby image component, that's when it starts to get clever. Okay, so it detects what device or browser you're on, viewport width, and it decides which image to show you. And one thing I love is it actually loads a tiny blurred pixelated version. And then as soon as the page is finished loading, it'll load what it deems to be the best size version for the page. It'll load that, and it will just gradually fade it up. And if you look at the site or any Gatsby site that uses Gatsby Image, it does look, I just think it looks really cool. And it's obviously, it's a big part of the reason why the homepage of my site loads so fast, is because all it is loading is a 0.5 kilobyte image. And the real image, even that is only 39 kilobytes. So to put that into context, this is an 1800 by 450, I think, banner. So it is quite large. That's the size that Gatsby has decided to show. I think my original one was 3,000 pixels wide that I put in the project directory. So it's chosen an 1800 pixel image for probably a screen, a browser about the size of my MacBook here, or a standard laptop. I tried to resize my image in Photoshop from whatever it was at maximum resolution down to 1800, and then use what compression tools were available. And I think the closest I could get it with the same sort of quality was about 90 kilobytes. When I did pull the quality down so it was closer to 40 kilobytes, it just looked awful. Now I'm not a Photoshop expert, and there's probably there obviously are some much better tools out there, but I couldn't easily get it anywhere close to that small by myself manually. And the fact that Gatsby does it all for you automatically, pretty much out of the box, I think is great. Now, none of these things are necessarily exceptional, but the fact it does it almost all for you is great. Okay, so that's Gatsby Image. Now this is a bit of a short talk. To round it off, we're going to talk about hosting. It's something I mentioned earlier, and it's one of the areas where Gatsby, and to be honest, all static sites are going to be a lot easier, going to make your life a lot easier than a React application or another JavaScript application. So what do we want from hosting? Well, we obviously want it to be, if it's for a personal site, we want it to be easy and cheap. If it's for a client, then that's not necessarily our concern so much, but certainly we want it to be easy and cheap. We want it to be easy to upload, definitely. So let's look at, we're going to look at actually, and this isn't, none of this is a sales pitch, but we're going to look at one host in particular that stands out for me, and that's Netlify. I don't know if anyone's heard of Netlify, but I'm sure some of you have. Netlify has kind of based its business model around Gatsby. I think also they're pretty popular for Vue as well, and a lot of other sites. So they've based their business model about making it as easy as possible to host this kind of site. So what does it do? You upload your source code to GitHub, and once you've configured Netlify and given it access, which is dead easy, it will automatically deploy your site. And then every time you check in a change to GitHub, it will automatically push that. My site takes just under a minute from when I push up the source code to being live, and it does that all automatically. Obviously, if something's gone wrong, it will fail and not upload it. And you do have a chance to roll back immediately. So yeah, you've got continuous integration and deployment there with Netlify. Now, it is free if you are hosting a personal blog, and I think you've got 100 gigabytes per month bandwidth, which I don't think I'm going to be getting through anytime soon. So they're obviously a big focus on getting people like us to use it. It doesn't seem too expensive for some of the bigger plans, which will allow multiple developers to work on it. But yeah, for my purposes, it's free, so that's a big bonus for me. Okay, now, probably I'm getting onto one of the disadvantages of Gatsby right at the very end, which is that if you hook it up to an external CMS, such as WordPress or Drupal or Contentful or any of the others, because Gatsby is generating static files, it doesn't know what your CMS is doing, because the site is built and then uploaded, and then any changes you make in your CMS are not, Gatsby doesn't really know about that. Again, that is obviously the disadvantage of static sites in this context. But what Netlify will do is it will accept it will set up a webhook, so you can quite easily configure, well, I don't know, depends on the CMS, but presumably it's quite easy to add this webhook anytime you update a post, add a new one, or in other situations which you can configure. That will send a notification to Netlify, which will then start the build process, pull in your new data, create the static HTML files, and deploy it. And I think that's about as simple as you're going to be able to get it. Okay, so that is the end of my talk on Gatsby. I hope it's been useful, even for those of you who've done a bit of Gatsby before. I really think it's worth checking out. I mean, obviously, it's most useful if you are a React developer. If you're used to Angular or Vue, then it's not necessarily going to have quite the same attraction. But yeah, if you're like me into React and you want to particularly if you want to work on a personal site or a side project, or even, certainly for client work, I think it is going to be a good thing, especially digital and creative agencies. I do think that it should be more popular, or will get more popular for that type of work, definitely. Okay, so that's it. Has anyone got any questions? So yeah, routing in a SPA. Well, Gatsby, I think as I mentioned before, whatever components you put in the pages directory, and the pages directory is something that gets set up for you, especially if you use one of the Gatsby starters. I didn't mention that. There's an amazing host of starter packages. So it gives you a pages directory. It looks in there. Any components in there, it will make a new page with that component, and the URL will be the same as the component name. So that's what it does. When it comes to more dynamic content, like blog posts, you have to use there's a Create Pages API, which you hook into the Node build process, and that build time, you sort of get your pages, you loop over them, take the path for each, and then you create a page with that path. So it's fairly simple, but I didn't go into that in detail here, and it is the kind of thing that you just look at a few of the starter packages, and it makes sense to do that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. So does it pre-render the HTML? Yes, it does. It renders all the HTML. I haven't inspected it too closely exactly what it does, but it does definitely render the HTML, so the page is very usable just as an HTML page. But then it brings in the JavaScript later. I think it does some pretty clever stuff, so that's why I can't give you an exact answer of exactly how it works. But it does, once it's all loaded, it does give you a fully functional React app, and all of your lifecycle methods and your components within that page, they're all still going to work. So would the posts, the query with GraphQL, would that replace the loop in WordPress? Yes, it would, because in WordPress, it's a while since I've used it, but you use the loop in your template files, and this basically replaces the need for template files. So if you're using WordPress, you would still set up WordPress, but you would use it just for the back end, so your clients or yourself would upload the content, and then WordPress exposes a REST API, so this would just pull in the data, and you'd completely bypass all of your template files in WordPress, so they wouldn't get used, and the loop would, there's no way to use the loop. So you'd just do it all in JavaScript. You'd loop over the object or the array that you get back. You'd loop over that and use your content. So I mean, WordPress is great. I'm definitely not knocking it. It is fantastic, and this is not going to be a direct replacement for a WordPress theme if you're on a bit of a time budget and you're used to using WordPress. It is definitely going to add in quite a bit of complexity having a Gatsby app on top. So you do need to really want the performance and the features that React and Gatsby give you. Okay. Oh. Thanks, Adam.